Welcome everyone. This is Ashfaqi Mohib. I am a PhD researcher in Wichita State University. I've been currently in USA, and I was in AIB faculty where I met Daniel Stanton, Mr. Supply Chain, and we are. I was also a PMI Bangladesh chapter member for a few years, one of the founding member of PMI Bangladesh chapter since 2008, and officially launched in Bangladesh in 2013. Uh, so, being it's a great pleasure. This is a PMI Bangladesh chapter has been moving a lot, moving forward. The community is coming forward. The speakers, a lot of good speakers are on the show, and obviously we are going to have one of the greatest speaker in the world with us, and so very excited, Mr. Supply Chain Daniel Stanton. He has a very wonderful presentation for us. Before we hand over to him, I would like Shohag Bhai, our Director of Professional Development, to say a few words. Shohag Bhai, floor is yours.
Thank you, Hubei. Hello and welcome you all to our today's webinar. I'm Shohag, Director PMI Bangladesh Chapter. Really happy to have you today for our special webinar on COVID-19 and beyond, using project management to mitigate supply chain disruptions. From PMI Bangladesh Chapter, as part of professional development, we have taken initiative to upskill our members and our project management community. As part of that, we have been arranging webinars on different knowledge area along with their practical application. This is our straight 9th webinar during this pandemic period. I'm really excited to learn and enjoy today's webinar from one of the top supply chain expert of the current world, Mr. Daniel Stanton, who is called to be Mr. Supply Chain. I hope you all are also excited. I'm sure all you can't wait a second to hear from Mr. Supply Chain. So I would like to give back the floor to Mohib Bhai so that he can immediately introduce our speaker without further delay. Over to Mohib Bhai.
Thank you, Shohag Bhai. Thank you so much. Let me introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Daniel Stanton, known as Mr. Supply Chain, all over the world, among his friends, colleagues, and peers, and his network connection of 45,000 plus. Mr. Daniel Stanton is a supply chain executive, an educator, an entrepreneur, and an Apex Charlotte, North Carolina chapter member. He is the author of Supply Chain Management for Dummies. 1 second, please. This is the book. And I have it autographed by him. Timohi. Thank you, Daniel. And this book has been a bestseller, in Amazon's bestseller in 5 different categories, namely production and operation, distribution, warehousing, project management, engineering management, and production management. So, a lot. His best-selling course in LinkedIn Learning have been viewed over 1 million times. And such courses are on supply chain management, operation management, project management, job skills in supply chain and operation, certification tools and tips. Folks, 1 million times plus. Stanton has been recognized as the IBM Watson Supply Chain Futurist and as a pro to know by Supply and Demand Chain Executive Magazine of 20 years for 3 consecutive years, 2018, 2019, and recently 2020. And I'm sure we will see him many more times. He earned his master's degree in logistics engineering from MIT and a doctoral researcher from Cranfield University, top universities in the world. Right? He is also a certified supply chain professional, CSCP from Apex, and also project management professional, PMP from PMI. So personally, I feel he indulges in his calling to educate the world. As a part of professional community, I feel we are ready to soak it all in. So it's great to have you here, Mr. Supply Chain Daniel Stanton. Welcome. Let's everybody give a big round of, I think over here, reactions with a clap. I give floor to Mr. Supply Chain Daniel Stanton. Welcome, welcome.
Mohib, thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys having me and the opportunity to share with a bunch of colleagues who are also focused on project management. And I'm going to make the case here. I think probably most of us are working somewhere in supply chains as well. And what I really want to what I want today is for us to have a discussion about that link between supply chain management and project management, and why both are really, really important for the world at this moment in time. Always been true, but I think right now is a great opportunity for us to really understand and appreciate what's going on. I am trying to share, but it says that I can't share because somebody else is sharing their screen. So
I am sharing. Hold on.
Okay.
So now we can?
Perfect. Are you able to see the first page of the presentation?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect.
All right, excellent. So, like anytime any of us get together to talk about anything professionally right now, we have to be talking about COVID-19, right? This is clearly globally the most important topic, especially for supply chain professionals and for project management professionals, because it's a disruption. It's changing everything about the way that we do business. It's forcing us to challenge our assumptions. And so that has to be where we start the conversation. But what I really want the conversation to be about is, okay, so what do we do differently? How do we think about what needs to be different? And how do we prepare for that so that we can manage going forward and be successful? So I think a good place to start is just with an explanation of what is a supply chain, because we use the term all the time. I am amazed at how often I see the term supply chain now in the media, on television, with politicians talking about supply chains. And yet, when you ask them, okay, so what does that mean? There isn't a lot of clarity. So my definition of a supply chain is a complex system that's made up of people, processes, and technologies that is engineered and managed to deliver something of value to a customer. And so some things that become really important when you use that definition, first of all, complex systems are, that's actually a field of study, right? We have systems all around us in our lives. The human body is a complex system. Automobiles are complex systems. The environment and ecosystems are complex systems. My view of supply chains is that they are systems in the same way. And then there are, what you begin to realize about complex systems is there dynamics that occur in those systems that it sort of doesn't matter what kind of system you're talking about. You can observe similar sorts of behaviors. So, for example, if you've ever heard the term the butterfly effect, right? Where a small change in one place, right? A butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the world, and through a series of unintended consequences, you end up with a typhoon in another part of the world, right? There's there are lots of these different sorts of ways of describing how small changes can have large unexpected effects somewhere else in a complex system. We see that all the time in supply chains. All right, so that's first one. The second part is the people, processes, and technologies. The truth is, most of the people that work in supply chains, we spend our time either focused on processes, Six Sigma, material requirements planning, lean production techniques, or we spend our time focused on technologies, right? Transportation management systems, warehouse management systems, blockchain, Internet of Things. Those are absolutely part of supply chains. But what we're really seeing over the last 3 months is how important people are as a part of those supply chains as well. We absolutely depend on the people being there to make the decisions, to do the work, and for them to be healthy and able to do their jobs well. And then the next piece is supply chains are engineered and managed, right? And so meaning there are some decisions there that are really about just the math, right? How do you optimize capacity and increase efficiency? And there are some decisions that are about the money, right? How do you do it in a way that it's profitable, that it's sustainable over the long term? And then the last thing is it's delivering something that a customer values, right? Because and what we value isn't just a product or a service, it's having the things that we want when we want them, where we want them, in the condition that we want them, in the right quantity. So all of those characteristics of products and services need to be addressed as a part of this supply chain that we're engineering and managing. So a long explanation, but I think there's a lot packed in there. And I think when we look at that, you say, well, literally every product and every service that we consume as human beings, and every product and every service that our companies deliver has a supply chain. And so this becomes really very important for everything. One of these unintended consequences, or one of these dynamics that we see all the time in supply chains, is called the bullwhip effect. And the bullwhip effect is when there's a small change in the demand for a product, it causes wild swings in inventory all the way up the supply chain. So a common way of demonstrating this, there's a game that was developed at MIT, I think in the 1950s, called the beer game. Often used in universities and professional development classes. The story is basically that you have 4 pieces in a supply chain for making beer, starting with a brewery, then going to distribution, warehousing, and the end retailer. And you make a small change in the demand at the retailer, and you see all of a sudden over the course of just a few rounds how in the same supply chain, some of the players have way more inventory than they can handle, while others are completely stocked out and they're unable to fulfill customer orders. It's not intuitive. It doesn't make sense. You wouldn't expect this to happen. And yet you see it every time that you play the game. It's consistent. And you see it all the time in the real world. So we saw this in the US, I think it was early March, when we started having the shortages of toilet paper and Clorox wipes in the United States. Classic example of the bullwhip effect, right? The reality is, I think COVID-19 is triggering lots of bullwhip effects in lots of supply chains all around the world, and will likely continue to do so for a while. I don't see a reason that this is going to stop anytime soon. Ironically, we're seeing other things happening around trade relations and political unrest that are just adding additional bullwhips, right? And so it's like, you throw a rock in a pond and you see the ripples go around it. Now we're just throwing lots and lots of rocks in the pond. And so we have turbulence throughout supply chains. And this triggers bullwhip effects. So what triggers the bullwhip effect is the disruption, right? And really it can be either a change in supply or a change in demand, right? Because a supply chain is fundamentally about balancing supply and demand. Well, what's interesting right now around the COVID-19 issues is I really see three different kinds of demand disruptions that are triggering bullwhip effects. So there are some scenarios where the demand for products has gone up or went up, but the consumption actually didn't change. And toilet paper was the example that we saw in the US, right? We didn't have an increase in the consumption of toilet paper, but suddenly everybody went to the store, and even if they bought just a little bit more, what that did is it created this bullwhip. The store wasn't replenishing and wasn't stocking and hadn't ordered enough to meet that level of demand because they had no reason to think it was going to be there. And so the store saw that that increased demand signal. And so they increased their orders to their distributors, who increased their orders to the factory. But that material just couldn't move through the supply chain fast enough to keep up with demand, even though the consumption hadn't changed, right? All we did really was move inventory from retail stores to our pantries at home. What you would expect to have happen in that case, because consumption didn't really change, is we've now stockpiled inventory at home. And so while there was a spike in sales for the stores, there will now be a glut in sales. Because now people have more than they need at home. They're going to stop buying until they burn off some of that inventory that they have. Very different issue than the products where the demand has gone up and the consumption has gone up, right? So we truly do have some products where we're buying more because we're using more. Certainly some medical devices. We've seen this a lot with the N95 masks. Anytime there's a new rumor or medical study about a medication that could be helpful in treating COVID-19, sales increase radically and it triggers these bullwhips. What I would argue is for things like the N95 masks, the latex gloves, some of the medications that are used to treat the disease, to the extent that we're probably going to be dealing with this issue for a while, that consumption is now just at a higher state, right? There's been a step change in the rate at which we're using those things. And so for those products, we need to scale up the capacity of our supply chains. We never needed to make and store and distribute as much of that in the past as we will in the future. So those supply chains, we need to increase manufacturing capacity, increase distribution capacity to figure out what that new level of demand is. One of the things that's really challenging about that is if you are not currently meeting the demand, meaning people are buying it faster than you can make it, then you have no way of knowing what the real demand level is. So what's going to happen with those supply chains is they're going to hit whatever that true demand is and go past it, because that you have to essentially saturate the market and make and distribute more than what people are going to consume before you can figure out what an actual steady state level of consumption is going to be. So for those products, I expect that we're going to have a bullwhip, but what's going to happen is we're going to overshoot the true demand. And then we're going to have to scale those supply chains back gradually to figure out and to meet the true level of demand going forward. The third place that we're seeing disruptions on the demand side is where demand has fallen off because of people not consuming things that they were 3 months ago. I read this morning that actually one of the largest theater chains in the United States is likely to go out of business. AMC, which Mohib, they're not too far from you. I think they're in Kansas City. anything having to do with sports or entertainment that involves going out, I think restaurants as well, the demand is just going to be lower going forward. And so, we need to anticipate that and prepare for that, because that affects a lot of supply chains. So we said disruptions can come from the demand side, but they can also come from the supply side. I think really we haven't seen as much of this, or we haven't talked about it as much, but I absolutely believe that this is going to be a problem where, if you can imagine an automobile, right, that maybe has 30,000 parts that need to come together at exactly the same place at the same time so that a finished automobile can go off the assembly line. Well, for those 30,000 pieces, parts that go onto the car, there may be 1,000 different suppliers around the world that supply directly to the automaker. And those 1,000 suppliers may have 100 suppliers that they buy components from to make their parts. And what you realize is that if any one of those pieces isn't there, it can force you to shut down the entire assembly line, right? So the automakers in the U.S. Early on in the COVID crisis just shut the plants. And the reason that they did that, obviously they wanted to, keep people from getting sick and spreading the disease, but the reality is they couldn't make cars, because they knew that this was going to happen, that they were going to start finding one part that couldn't be made by a supplier someplace because they had been shut down by government policy, or because the people had become sick, or they couldn't get the parts that they needed. Rather than fighting through, part after part, supplier after supplier, they just closed their plants. And they're in the process now of securing their supply chains, making sure that they have visibility to who their suppliers are and what condition they're in. And then they're going to gradually begin to ramp up production again. Okay, so when we talk about disruption in supply chains, right? Disruptions happen. It's just part of doing business. You can't predict everything, but there's a big difference between a disruption that is managed well and one that is managed poorly. And this graph, I apologize, I should have cited where it came from, but it was a study that was done of supply chain disruptions that basically said organizations that do a good job of preparing for and responding to disruptions have a shorter, less of an impact for a shorter period of time, which is that blue line. The ones that don't respond well, the impact is much, much deeper and takes a whole lot longer, right? So this becomes the business case for why we need to anticipate and prepare for disruptions and why we need to manage them well. What we're trying to do is minimize the amount of disruption and shorten the time for us to recover. There is, right, and this now gets to folks that are looking at putting processes into place in organizations, or for folks that study it in academia. There's actually an international standards organization standard out there for risk management. It's the 31,000, the latest one was 2009. And basically it just maps out a process flow to say, this is how an organization should handle risk management, figuring out what could go wrong, preparing for it, and responding to it. So there are tools out there that we can draw from to implement risk management as a process within our company and within our supply chain. And this is a good one to start with. What I like to do, this is really my approach to education, is how do we take what can be some pretty complicated topics and boil them down into tools that are easy to use, easy to remember, and easy to explain. And so what I'm going to share in the next couple of slides are two of those tools. One is an approach that I recommend for preparing for disruptions. And the next one is a tool that I use for leading projects and things that we can do very often when we need to respond to a disruption. So if you think about what we need to do to prepare for a supply chain disruption, there are really 7 steps in the process. First, we have to figure out what are the risks that are possible. Now, each of us can do this on our own, right? I mean, you can sit down with a piece of paper or sit down in front of a computer and just kind of brainstorm, right? Think about what are the things that could go wrong. And you have to give yourself some creative license to just go with this and think about things that are sometimes hard to think about and hard to believe. We can do this individually. I really think it's a powerful thing to do as a group. And very often I'll bring in an independent outside facilitator, somebody that doesn't have a stake in the discussion, just to get a team to think and talk openly and creatively about what are the challenges that we should consider. What are the things that we aren't thinking about that could put our company, our team, or our supply chain into jeopardy? Then the next step is, okay, what results would that produce, right? And so, an example could be if a typhoon came through, right? That's something that's possible. Well, how would that affect us, right? It could cut off power. It could prevent people from being able to come to work. It could take the lives of some of the people on our teams. It could hurt our customers in some way, right? Thinking through all of those results. Once you've done that, you can estimate the impact. And, this is a very subjective thing, but it's often useful to try and turn this into numbers just so that we can rank importance. So, an easy way to do this is to have a scale of 1 to 10 and just say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, if a typhoon were to come through, how severe would the impact of that be? A 10 being, we just have to close the business and go home. And a 1 being, we might have to take a couple days off. You can determine how you define that scale. The next step, determine the probability. How likely do we think it is that will happen? Then you can take the impact and the probability, and the same thing, right? Put the probability on a scale of 1 to 10, and then you can just multiply the impact times the probability to create a risk score. So something that has a low impact and a low probability is going to show up low on the list. Something that has a high impact and a high probability is going to be at the top of the list, right? Those are the ones that you really need to make sure that you're doing something about. You'll also find there are some in the middle, right, that maybe have a really high impact, but maybe not a high probability. A lot of times we'll call those black swan events. There's a whole book written about high impact, low probability events. It's an interesting thing to study because those are often blind spots, right? The things that we just didn't realize were likely to happen, but if they do happen, they have a huge impact. And a lot of people will make the argument COVID-19 as an example of that. All right. Once we analyze the scores, the next thing is to decide how would we respond, right? And the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the 5 options you have for responding. Once you make a decision about how you want to respond and you put a plan in together, then you need to educate your team, right? Because I've seen this many times when organizations go through this process, put together a great plan, and then they put it on the shelf, but the people that would actually need to execute it don't know that it's there, or it becomes out of date, or they, at the end of the day, they don't know what they need to do at the very moment that, the crisis emerges and you need everybody to respond quickly and properly. Okay, so that's how we prepare for the disruption. Let's take a step back and talk about these responses to uncertainty. It turns out for any risk that we ever run into in our lives, there are really only 4 or 5 different approaches, right? So one thing you can do is you can avoid the risk, right? Change something so that risk no longer applies to you. If you're concerned about typhoons, Move inland and up into the mountains, right? Then you avoid that risk. You can transfer the risk, right? This is what we do when we buy insurance. We pay somebody else money to accept the risk that something bad will happen and to reimburse us or take care of the problem if it does occur. We can accept the risk, right? Which just, hey, that's part of doing business. If, that could happen and we'll deal with it if it comes. We can mitigate the risk. Mitigating the risk means we do something to reduce the impact or to reduce the probability. There are lots of things that we can do to mitigate risks. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. And then the fifth one that we've got on this chart is controlling the risks. I have a hard time separating how control is different from mitigate. For me, that becomes a very gray line. But I think the idea with controlling the risk is it's something that you manage. You know that that's a part of your business. And what this graph tries to do then is to say, well, if you have a risk, if the left-hand side here is a graph of impact, and along the bottom it is probability, then you'd say, okay, so a risk that has a high impact and a low probability, we'll transfer that, we'll buy insurance. A risk that has a low impact and a low probability, we're willing to accept. A risk that has a high impact and a high probability, we want to avoid it. We want to find ways to make that go away. A risk that has a low impact and a high probability, we're just going to control that. We're going to manage that as a part of our business. And anything that's in the middle, well, those are the things that we need to mitigate, right? What are the things that we can do to reduce the probability, reduce the impact, and try and move it into a range where we're willing to accept it? All right, so now let's talk about, as project managers, right, what it takes to lead a project. And this is especially true when we have to be moving quickly, right? Responding to a disruption requires us to do the right things and to do them quickly without missing anything. I make the argument that project leaders really have 6 responsibilities. The first thing that we need to make sure happens in any project is we need to define the challenge or the opportunity. We need to make sure that everybody understands what it is we're really trying to do. The second thing we need to do is we need to investigate the options, right? We don't want to jump into the first thing just because it's the first thing that we thought about. We want to make sure that we're spending enough time to understand what our options are, what we could be doing, and what the pros and cons of each are likely to be. Once we've done that, but there's also that risk with investigating the options of getting caught in this loop where we continually are asking for more data, more ideas, when at some point you just need to resolve to a course of action. You need to pick one of those options, even though it may not be perfect, but make the decision, this is what we're going to do, and then resolve to a course of action, right? Build the plan and think about what it's going to take to do that well. The next step, of course, is executing the plan. And this is a lot of where project managers end up being visible to the organization, right? It's what's your status? Did you complete the task? Did you have problems with that? Do we need to have a meeting to update our stakeholders, right? Executing the plan and making sure that it gets done and that it gets done within the scope, the schedule, and the budget that were defined. The next two, the first of all is changing over the system, right? So in almost any project I have ever worked on, there came a point when we needed to make a change to the way that we were doing things. Could be a different process. It could be a new technology. And when you're making that change, like that in itself is a little project, right? The day that you're making the switch over from the way that you did it to the way you're going to do it going forward needs to be managed so carefully, because so often it's when you're making the switch that things go south, and then a lot of good work that was done in the lead up to the project can be undone or can be reflected on poorly by not managing that change well. And then the last thing that we need to be concerned about as project leaders is transitioning the people. And this comes, there's a great book by William Bridges called Managing Transitions. And what Bridges says is, change is one thing, but change happens around us. Change happens to us, and it happens all the time. Transition is our response to that. It's our ability to accept that, to deal with it, and to react in a positive way. And no matter what the change is in our lives, whether it's changing a job or relocating to a new place, we have to go through an emotional journey to let go of the old way and accept a new one. And there's a process, there's a psychological process that every one of us goes through every time we deal with how we respond to a change. As project leaders, we need to understand that everybody that's affected by our project needs to make that transition. And we need to account for that. We need to plan for that as a part of our project to ensure that it's going to be successful. So these are the 6 responsibilities for us when we lead projects. Knowing this, I use the metaphor of a director of a movie, right? Making sure that the sound is right and the actors are on their spot at the beginning of a scene and that the lighting is all right. That's what we're doing as project managers, is we are directing the project, and remembering these 6 responsibilities can help us be effective directors. All right. So supply chain resilience is a really big deal. And we can see that today more than probably ever in my lifetime. Supply chains are becoming more and more complex, right? Because of geography, because products are becoming more complex, science and technology. We're just there is no avoiding the fact that modern supply chains are complex and becoming more complex every year. Disruptions not only are occurring, but they're occurring more often, right? If you think about the way we've been hit, one wave after another, just in 2020, it is incredibly challenging, and there is no indication that it's going to be letting up and getting easier anytime soon. One of the things that's really scary in any complex system is the risk of concurrent disruptions. So we tend to prepare for a disruption to happen in isolation. What if there were a typhoon? What if there were an earthquake? What we almost never are able to do is to say, well, what would happen if there were a typhoon and an earthquake at the same time, right? And that's what causes systems very often to fail, is very often a system can respond and be resilient to a point of to damage in one place, but it caves in when it becomes disrupted in multiple ways. And then the last one that I think we all need to have on the list is cyber threats. This is companies are being, and governments frequently victimized by malware and by ransomware. And our supply chains are so dependent on information technology that we have to think about those threats, prepare for those threats, and be ready to respond to those threats. And that's really not something that most supply chain people and most project managers have traditionally viewed as a part of our responsibility. So what I will say is I think project management is really critical to supply chain management. And supply chain management is really critical to society. The key link there is we need our supply chains to be resilient and adaptable, because all of the products and services that we all count on are the result of supply chains. Those supply chains, the way that they adapt is through projects, and managing projects effectively then becomes the key to making sure that our supply chains are able to prepare for and respond to disruptions. So that's the stuff that I wanted to share, and I really hope that it triggers a conversation about some of the things that you all are facing. So let me pass the microphone back over. And does that seem useful and relevant, and does that resonate with some of the things that you guys are seeing and working on right now?
Thank you, Daniel. We are always keep learning, especially from you. Before I go to some great questions, I want to acknowledge some of the participants we have here. We have our regular PMI Bangladesh chapter members who are continuously visiting these sessions. Welcome. And we also see from CLT, Mr. Tanzil Ruhullah, he's also here. He's also a recipient of your autograph book. And I also see from Supply Chain Education Alliance, he's there, and Bangladesh Supply Chain Society is also here. And we also see Dr. Charles C. Villanova. He's the Dean of Business School and Academic VP of AIUB, American International University. And we also see lots of faculties and some graduating students. So it's a very well diversified crowd, audience that has come to be with you today. And I appreciate that. And thank you so much. Let's go to some of the questions I have jotted down. Okay, here. First, we start from Ms. Shafina. She says, thank you, PMI Bangladesh chapter. It's a comment for having us here with Mr. Supply Chain. It's a very demanding discussion of today. Okay, thank you, Ms. Shafinas. Here is a question that is question to Daniel from Muhammad Ashraf Islam Khan. What sort of optimization strategy should we start immediately after the pandemic?
It's a great question. So often when you're looking at these important supply chain questions, of course, the answer is, well, it depends. I think a lot of the suggestions that I have heard people make on TV, honestly, in the last month or two, are not good strategies. So I'll talk about some of those things and I'll explain why. And then I'll provide some maybe general thoughts about what I think does help with optimization. So two of the things that I've heard argued a lot. One is that just in time is bad. And the second one that I've heard a lot is this is why our supply chains should not be global. So around the just in time is bad. It's wrong. Just in time actually is, a part of improving efficiency, which reduces cost, which is good for everybody. The alternative to just in time is just in case. Sometimes just in case is the right strategy, but not always. It doesn't do anybody any good most of the time to have a bunch of extra inventory sitting around in a supply chain. It slows things down, it increases costs, it lowers quality because things get old, they rust, they go stale. So just in time is good, but we need to understand where are the places in a just-in-time supply chain that there are vulnerabilities, and what are things that we can do to mitigate those vulnerabilities, to make it less risky? Sometimes the answer is to have more inventory. Sometimes the answer could be to have alternative suppliers, right? If our supplier isn't able to give us what we need, we've got other places that we can get that. Sometimes the alternative is to have expedited transportation as an option, right? If I'm running a just-in-time supply chain that relies on containers coming across the ocean, and there's a risk that a supplier, could miss a shipment, or that, maybe a container falls off a ship in the ocean. Well, having more inventory isn't necessarily the right answer there. Maybe being able to use air cargo is a better alternative. So I reject the argument that just-in-time is bad. I think doing just-in-time, it makes sense, but you can't do that without doing risk analysis and understanding your points of vulnerability. The second argument that I've heard a lot is, well, this is why we should inshore everything, right? We shouldn't have global supply chains. And I think that's, I think that's wrong. I think doing away with global trade doesn't eliminate supply chain risks. All it does is change them, right? So if we move to a place where everybody is growing all of their food locally and not importing food from other regions or other parts of the world, what does that mean? It means we have fewer choices, right? Because you're only going to have domestically grown food. And it also means that we become more vulnerable to food shortages if there is some sort of a natural disaster, if there's a drought, if there is a typhoon, a hurricane. Having global supply chains gives us more choices. It actually can provide greater resilience because you've got multiple suppliers, multiple sources, and it gives us lower costs. So it makes things more efficient and available. So those are two things that I've heard lots of people argue for that to me actually don't make any sense at all. Now, what can we do? What should we do to optimize supply chains? I do believe that simplicity is good, right? The simpler any system is, the easier it is to understand what your risks are and to respond to them when there is a disruption. The single biggest gap that I have seen in most of the supply chains that I've worked with is visibility. It is remarkable to me how many organizations actually can't give you a list of who their suppliers are, where those suppliers are located. It sounds trivial, but if you think about that as the first step in understanding your supply chain, I mean, you should be able to walk into a meeting and say, give me the list of all of your suppliers. Where are their manufacturing plants? Where are their distribution facilities? What carriers do they use to transport goods from their facilities to yours? Almost nobody has that. If you take it a step further and say, who are the suppliers that they depend on? Who are my tier 2 suppliers? Almost nobody has that, right? Because if you go to one of your vendors, one of your suppliers and say, hey, can you tell me all the companies that you buy stuff from? That is a very difficult conversation to have for a lot of reasons. So there are tools out there. There are companies that provide services that can help with supply chain visibility. I think organizations should have teams internally that's their job, is to figure out who your suppliers are and to create a supply chain control tower, to create a way of getting visibility to who your suppliers are, where they are, and then if you can start mapping that to potential sources of disruption like weather issues, political unrest, fires, right? That makes it easier for you to see what's happening and to respond quickly, right? Because one of the basic laws of dealing with supply chains is the sooner you know about a problem, the more options you have to respond to it, and the less it's going to cost you, right? So the way that you don't want to find out about a problem is to have it blow up as a crisis. You want to find out about it as soon as possible. So I hope that helps as an answer, right? That it isn't about building up more inventory. It's about understanding our supply chains better, modeling how they would behave in a variety of different scenarios, thinking about alternative ways of responding to those scenarios and investing in those mitigation or response strategies so that you can, and then getting visibility so that you can move quickly when something happens.
Great. Excellent response, excellent insight. Thank you, Daniel. So it is more on not just in time, no more lean, more maybe going into flexibility, more flexible supply chain, just in case.
Absolutely.
Here's another great question from Mr. Air Commodore Mohammed Anwar Haq Sardar. He's a retired, and he's the CEO of aviation in Magna Group. For COVID-19, more than anything of the past disasters, aviation have now assessed to suffer impact called L-shaped or depression, meaning this industry is below the recovery line to expected growth in 2020. But aviation is essentially important for vital supply chain to remain open and efficient. How do you think aviation still can be resilient? Excellent question.
It's a great question, and it's a really hard one, right? I don't know about the numbers in Bangladesh. I know in the U.S., when we talk about air cargo capacity, about half of it is on freighters, and about half of it, as of January in 2020, was belly cargo, meaning it sat underneath passenger planes. And so, what we saw is factories shut down in China because of COVID-19, which meant they weren't shipping on container ships. And so as things started to reopen, there was a greater demand for air cargo capacity, yet we had put up restrictions on passenger flights. So we lost at the same time that we had this growing demand for air cargo, we were actually taking capacity out of the market. I completely agree. I think air cargo is vitally important for global supply chains. We saw it, lots of stories of medical supplies being air freighted around the world to get things to first responders quickly. And I think that industry financially is taking a huge hit, and it's going to be a slow recovery. Long term, I tend to fall back on Adam Smith and the invisible hand and supply and demand. It's not that air cargo won't exist. It's that the prices for everything in the aviation supply chain are going to have to go up for that to still be profitable and sustainable in an environment where you've got fewer customers that are utilizing it. In the short term, I know what's happening in the U.S. is it seems like there are subsidies going to some of the passenger airlines to help keep them in business. From what I hear, the U.S. Cargo carriers, FedEx, UPS, that group are doing fine. I think if anything, their capacity is maxed out, so I don't think they're in financial trouble. I think it's the passenger airlines that are in trouble. But realizing what an impact that has on the rest of the supply chain for new aircraft and for aircraft parts, no business can sustain the loss of 50% of its customers, right? And keep continue to be profitable and efficient. So my guess is there will be some consolidation in that industry. Maybe some of those companies won't be able to operate profitably, and some of the others are going to have to raise their prices in order to continue to be profitable and serve a smaller number of customers. Not a happy answer, but I think a realistic one.
Okay, that leads to our next question about consolidating. Excellent. This is from Mahmoud Chaudhary. What is the prediction on supply chain shocks and disruption in coming months for a country like Bangladesh, which is heavily dependent on raw materials import for and RNG export? This is related to the inshoring, reshoring thing we were discussing earlier. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and that goes, it's both sides of the supply and demand equation, right? I think there are likely to be big drops on the demand side, and then I hear somebody else's coworker, and I don't know if everybody heard, we had the conversation before the call. We don't refer to them as children anymore. Now they're just coworkers. So I hear somebody's coworker chiming in, and I love it. So, I think about textiles, for example, that the demand for textiles has to be linked to social interaction, right? If I'm sitting at home for months at a time, I'm not buying new clothes. I've got nobody to impress. And so that's really going to kill some of the demand. Even though I could buy some stuff, if I needed new clothes, I'm probably going to buy them online. I'm not going to go to a department store. But if you see department stores going out of business, which we do now, that's going to impact demand for those materials or for those products. And then, one of the other things that I'm really concerned about, and I use the example of the U.S. Food supply chain for domestic food, but I suspect the same logic holds in Bangladesh and elsewhere. I'm really concerned about what happens if COVID-19, if the virus starts to spread among farm workers, right? Because if those people are sick and aren't able to plant crops and to harvest crops or to work in food processing facilities, when you start to shut facilities down or you start to shut farms down simply because the people are sick, right? And they can't work. Well, that creates these ripple effects and shortages of food. The same thing could happen for any product. So any place that, people work in close quarters or where they interact, through public transportation, it sure seems to me like for many, many months to come, there's going to be a risk of, people getting sick and hot spots forming. And I think we're going to see more of these disruptions. That said, there are things that we can do to try to protect our companies and our teams and to mitigate the impacts. And we can just prepare for it and say, okay, if it happens, what will we do? Even though, we don't like it, at least if we have a plan in place, we're ready for it. And one of the examples I'll share just real quickly is we got to this place about 3 weeks ago as a family. So before 3 weeks ago, our focus was, how do we make sure that we never, ever contract the disease and our house is safe? And just the way things are moving forward, we sort of had this pivot and said, we want to put it off as long as we can, but it just seems almost inevitable that eventually somebody's going to get it. We've had friends now who've gotten sick. We've talked to our doctor a lot about other patients that they've had. And so what happened 3 weeks ago when we did that is we sat down and we put together the plan. We said, okay, if one of us in our family gets infected, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle that? Let's build an actual plan and make sure that we have the things that we need so that we'll be able to take care of ourselves and take care of our kids for what seems like, it's likely to be a 5-week period of, going through sickness to recovery.
Oh, great insight, great thoughts. That actually answers one of the question on supply chain on agriculture. So on that, I'm going to move to, this is from AKM Nurul Huda. He's one of our most talented supply chain expert in Bangladesh with lots of experience of integrating 14 subsidiaries into one. And now he's looking into how can we increase visibility in supply chain, very related to the topic you've been talking about, the supply chain tower, control tower. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I got to do a project with this when I was working with a global manufacturing company. It was one of the cooler projects I've ever gotten to work with, and it is hard. A lot harder than you'd expect. I write about it a little bit in the book. There's some reference there, and I've updated a little bit. By the way, I'm working on the second edition for the book. I think it'll be out later this year. And one of the things that I've revised is the chapter where we talk about risk management, just because we've learned so much and we've gotten so many good examples over the last couple of months. I'll share one of the things that was most eye-opening to me walking through that journey of trying to increase supply chain visibility. We thought, step one, let's make a list of all of our suppliers and where they're located, right? That seems pretty logical. And so in our case, it was mostly dumping that information out of our enterprise resource planning system, SAP, and we had some others. And we thought, well, that's good. That's just, run a report and we'll know who all our suppliers are. Well, it turns out that's not the case for a couple of reasons. First of all, suppliers tend to operate with lots of different legal entities. So it may be one company, right, that you're dealing with, but there may be 10 different legal entities that are variations of a name or different spellings, and so pulling the report, you couldn't tell that, right? It wasn't easy. We also had lots of situations where, the company name had been entered slightly differently. So it showed up as different companies, right? One time it may be Acme Inc. The next time it's Acme Incorporated. On the report, those seem like different companies, even though it's the same firm. So that was one challenge is just figuring out who our suppliers really were. The next thing was, well, where are the suppliers located? Well, yes, of course, we had an address for every supplier in the system, but guess what? That address, that's where we send the check. That isn't where they make the products. That isn't where they store the products and ship them to us. It turns out, in most cases, we had no idea where things were made or where they were stored. So it really takes some detective work to reach out and figure those things out. And by the way, that changes all the time, right? Not only do, suppliers move their factories, but, they may use overflow warehouses. Sometimes they would actually rent warehouse space near our facilities just so that it was easier for them to respond to orders. So what I'll say is getting that visibility requires you to build relationships and to communicate closely with your suppliers. There's no other way to do it. It can't be done automatically, right? Because the data that you get from just sort of virtual communications or pulling a report from the database will make you feel good, and it will be wrong. And if the data is wrong and you feel good, then you're actually more vulnerable than if you knew the data was wrong and you were scared. I will also say in the last few years, there's several companies that have developed software solutions that are useful for parts of this. So one of the other challenges that we ran into, by the way, it was hard to figure out where our suppliers were. Once we figured that out, we realized we couldn't see material when it was in transit. So once it left a supplier, we lost visibility until it showed up at our dock door. So that's the other piece, is making sure that you have, you know where the nodes in your supply chain are, and then knowing, being able to monitor the flows. So a couple of companies that I'll highlight. One, DHL has just spun off a group in the last year or so called Resilience 360. Resilience 360 is doing a lot to share information about supply chain disruptions, right? So if you know where the nodes in your supply chain are, then Resilience 360 is useful for giving you information about what's happening there. There's another company that I love to talk about. The founder's a friend of mine, but I love the technology. And it's called Tive, Tive. And Tive, they're basically little trackers that are about the size of a cell phone that you can throw onto a pallet or throw into a package, but they're GPS trackers. So it lets you see where your shipments are anywhere in the world. And they can also do condition monitoring. They have light monitors and temperature monitors. So you can tell if a container has been opened, you can tell if it got hot or if it stayed cold. That becomes incredibly useful for getting visibility for your supply chain, right? Because now you're using real data, not assumptions. If a shipment sort of takes a detour along its way to you, you begin to learn what your supply chain is really doing. I'll give you another just really cool example to tie into that, though. So what I'll say is visibility has value in supply chain planning and optimization and management, but it's very hard to justify the investments in visibility until you've had to use it. But once you have it, you find ways to create value with it. And a great example is if you're shipping food in the United States, very often, if it's food that has to be kept cold, you need to put it on a special truck that has a refrigerator built in. We call that a reefer, right? So, if you know that food needs to be kept at 0 degrees centigrade or colder, well, you have to pay for a reefer truck to move it so that you make sure that it doesn't, get too warm and spoil. However, it's sort of silly to be paying for a refrigerator to ship food in a cold climate during the winter, right? So you could save money shipping in winter if you could put that same food onto a regular trailer and just know that it was cold enough outside that it never got warm and spoiled. So these Tive trackers, very often what they'll do is they use that to track the food that's being shipped in regular trailers. And the difference in cost between a regular trailer and a refrigerated trailer more than makes up for the expense of adding the Tive tracker in. Mohib, you're on mute.
Mr. Huda, who's also a recipient of your book and studying the SCORE model right now, thanks you a lot. That leads to our next question, which is, how do you think, from Shabuddin, how do you see automation, artificial intelligence, big data in supply chain coming in effect? And I'm going to include another, what are the trainings that we can take to improve ourselves?
Yeah.
Analytics.
Both great questions. And you're really, that's, you're teeing me up on especially the second one. So I'll talk about the automation piece, and I don't remember what page it's on, but there in the book I talk about this concept of the information value chain, and I think technology innovation is incredible, the rate at which we're seeing innovation. And I think automation in supply chains is pretty much inevitable, right? We've seen it for many, many years. It's part of what's given us modern civilization. What's different now is that computers are able to think and make decisions and take action, whereas before we were just replacing manual labor with automation. Now we're replacing decision making with automation. I don't think it does any good to be opposed to it. I just think that it's inevitable, and if it's done correctly, it has a lot of benefits. The way that I tend to look at it, I don't see jobs being automated. What I see happening is tasks are automated, right? So there are individual functions, individual tasks that today people can do better than computers, right? And those tend to be things involving putting ideas together, using our judgment based on past experience. But what's happening with artificial intelligence is that computers are able to look at a much larger data set. We're able to train them against a data set, and then they can see the key decision points and make a decision based on historical data faster than a human being could, right? So replacing our judgment with some sort of a statistical analysis. That is happening, and it will continue to happen. I think, though, we've got lots of examples of where we see that there are real limitations to that. And so, I'll use the example of forecasting product demand in supply chains, right? This is something that every supply chain has to do, is you have to make a guess about how much your customers are going to buy from you, right? Because you use that guess, your estimate, your approximation for what your sales are going to be, to drive all of the upstream decisions in your supply chain. How much manufacturing capacity should you have? How many people do you need to hire? How much do you need to order from your suppliers so that you can make the stuff that your customers are going to buy? Well, how do computers generate that forecast? Well, they do it based off of historical data. And so in general, a computer can analyze all that data, and you give it a set of rules and it'll produce a forecast, and it can do that much faster and much more accurately than a person could do by hand. But when you change the situation with something like COVID-19, all of a sudden the past no longer represents the future. You cannot rely on historical statistics as a proxy for future probabilities. And I don't, it takes a person to understand, okay, wait a minute, there are three different kinds of demand disruptions and the potential for supply disruptions. How do we factor that in to create a new set of rules that we can then feed into the computer for it to create better forecasts going into the future? I'll use that as an example to say what I think automation is doing is making the human judgment parts of supply chains and projects more and more important, even though it is taking many of those tasks that humans would have done in the past away. So that's the lead into the question of education and training. I think we are, as professionals, at a place that we always have to be ready to be disrupted, right? We have to acknowledge that somebody in some other part of the world may be able to do my job better than I can for less money, or some technology may make my job irrelevant and obsolete, or the tasks that I do. And the only way to stay ahead of that is to push ourselves continually to be learning, right? Stay abreast of what's happening, stay abreast of new technologies, stay abreast of what's happening in the world. The good news is we now have platforms, and I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn Learning, where you can go and pick up skills from classes that are professionally produced, really thought through, well organized, and they are equally available to anybody anywhere in the world. Whereas, even a few years ago, you really, had to go into a classroom and be face to face with somebody. Today, in part even driven by the coronavirus stuff, anything that you want to learn likely is available online, right? As an online class or through Zoom. There's another program for folks that are really interested in doing supply chain stuff more. I talk about this. So on LinkedIn Learning, I have a whole class about supply chain certifications where I talk about CILT and APICS and CSCMP and PMI, right? Different certifying bodies and certifications that can be useful in the supply chain. One of the other programs I talk about, MIT now has a supply chain micromasters program that you can take for free. Anybody in the world can take the entire program for free. It is hard. This is not a lightweight something you do on a weekend. I think it's like an 18-month journey. So it's a graduate level online course. If you want to get the certificate, you have to pay like $1,200 for the whole thing. But if you only want the knowledge, you can take it for free.
Wow, great information, great information. Shohag Bhai is pinpointing at me saying it's almost time to take pictures.
Yes,
So,
we need to take pictures, so we should not be missing the opportunity to have a picture with Mr. Supply Chain. I'm sure participants will be liking to have a picture with.
still have 90 participants in here, which is our record now.
It's a great crowd.
Great questions, and super answers. I love how you take the very difficult question and change it and say it in a very generalized format so everybody can understand. That's Mr. Supply Chain. Okay, shall I, what do I do, Mr. Shohag Bhai?
Please request all participants to make the video on so that we can have better picture.
Yeah, videos are locked by the hosts. Can you turn it on? Yes.
Oh, so many.
What?
My video is locked by my host.
Your host, please.
Actually, it's on because the other participants can actually switch on the video. May I also request everyone to put a clap for Daniel for such a nice session.
Okay.
How about some thumbs up? Yeah.
Good one, sir.
Great session, Daniel. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you all so much. I know it's late there. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I love making this connection from all around the world. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, let's all thank Mr. Supply Chain Daniel Stanton for being with us, being in Bangladesh with us in virtual world, and we are always learning from him. Please do connect with him in LinkedIn. Share your pictures. He's got 46,000 so far. So with Bangladesh being connected to him directly, it will be even more. And he's always posting great information. Just reading his post, I get to learn so much, and I'm sure we'll all learn. He's part of our Bangladesh chapter, Daniel Bhai. We call him Daniel Bhai.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And so with that, Sohag Bhai, shall I close it? Would you like to say something? We have
Shwag Bhai, you are on.
Mohit bhai, you need to mute yourself first.
Hello.
Sohag Bhai, you would like to say something about joining the chapter?
So I would like to thank everyone for joining the session and for continuous support to PMI Bangladesh chapter. And of course, for connecting with us, we have got our Facebook page, we have got our LinkedIn page. So please do connect with us and stay with us so that we can also continue learning together. So like today, then the way Daniel helps us to learn so many things. We will continue all learning together, and that's it from today. And once again, thanks to Daniel, Mr. Supply Chain, for making time for Bangladesh chapter. We really appreciate your contribution, and we will remember you for that. And in future, if you need your support, we will again request you to help us learning continuously. And let us put our hands together for him once again.
Thank you. With that, I thank everyone, and especially the participants and the audience from various walks of life and professional societies, universities, and definitely thank you, Daniel. It is my honor, pleasure to have you here. With that, we close the session for today. Thank you so much.